So today let's talk what we'll call part two for talking about language and storytelling. So as I've said many times, language is political, right? Whether you want it to be or not, it's not neutral. And we have a few examples of that. For example, over in Ireland, right? You can speak English, but there are very political connotations to speaking in public in Irish. The other example would be India, right? In India, they have hundreds, possibly thousands of languages. I apologize for not researching ahead of time to get the exact figure, but a lot of different languages, right? They're not all mutually intelligible. So when India was forcibly united under colonialism, we had the situation where, similar to the Sunni Shiite situation in the Middle East when they were trying to put Iraq back together, there was the situation where they have to decide, what language do we conduct business in? Because if you choose one language over another, you are essentially saying that you value that ethnic identity over another, if you're making that official, right? That's one of the debates that comes up every few years here in the United States as far as the English-only crowd. There are a number of people who think that English should be the only language spoken in the United States. That's a stupid bunch of asshattery. Founding fathers didn't create a national language for a reason, even though they did debate one. And let me tell you, English wasn't the one they were thinking of picking, a lot of them. But there's a debate that comes up every few years on immigrants come to the United States. They don't necessarily learn English. I think that's a bunch of bunk. I know a lot of immigrants, English is something that's important to them because they want to do business and live here. It's more like they don't learn English right away, and people who have known it since they were 2 or 3 years old think that makes them dumber or less worthy because they haven't had that exposure since toddler age. That's the thing that you got to remember about language and the fact that it is political. You have to remember that language is learned. It's a learned thing. No language is innate. People don't just pop up with it. There was an experiment hundreds of years ago where a king, he was trying to find the language of God, right? Because in if you know Abrahamic theology, there's the story of Babel, right? They build the tower, God says no thanks, and he knocks down the tower, and then he doesn't want people to collaborate on any projects like that again, so he confounds them by creating a bunch of different languages. And then the people who spoke the same languages ended up getting together so they could communicate with each other, and that was the start of societies and foreigners and all that as far as the Bible's concerned, right? So this king, he says, hey, since language is learned, because they knew that even back then, we want to find the language of God. We'll take these kids and we'll leave them in the wilderness in a hut where they'll never see anybody, right? And the only person who will ever see them, it'll just be this one old woman, and all she'll do is feed them. She's not going to talk to them at all. And they will be observed to see if they speak any words. Then we'll find out what language those words are in. Then we'll find out the language of God, and we'll know what language is the original human language, right? It's a dumb experiment, but for its time, there's some pretty interesting thought process. Cruel thing to do to some kids, But it shows us, language is number one, learned, and it goes back to language being political. Can you imagine if we knew that God was real, and then we knew what language God spoke? Can you imagine the impact that would have on people as far as language goes? The people who already speak that language, man, their heads would be getting pretty big about it, right? They're speaking the language of God. That means, like, from a theological perspective of a lot of people, that they are closer to God, right? That's the kind of dangerous thinking that can happen. And what does all this have to do with stories? I haven't mentioned narratives at all in this time. Well, think about that when you're putting it into your stories. I talked about before when we were talking about believable aliens, and when we talked about believable aliens, it was the Planet of the Hats thing that goes on in Star Trek a lot, where, like, there is a Klingon language, right? We have English, Japanese, Spanish, Russian, all of those we know exist in the world of Star Trek. It's suggested that French does as well, because Picard swears a little in French, right? We know all of those languages exist. And there isn't, like, Earth language, right? So we have all of those different ones, but then whenever someone's bringing up something else, it'd be like, it means such and such in Klingon, it means such and such in Vulcan, right? That's not the way language works. But because language is political, you have to consider in your story who's in power, what language do they speak. And when it comes to diplomacy, if you're talking about aliens dealing with other people, if you're talking about elves dealing with humans or dwarves, you have to think about what language they would be using to communicate with the outside world. Because that would go back to how much importance do they put on the contact with the outside world? How much practicality do they want in some kind of trade language, right? All things to consider. Another thing that I just wanted to touch on briefly, because a lot of people just don't consider it, and I think it's worth taking a look at, is place names and the names of people, right? So one thing that you should be pretty aware of is that names have meanings, right? If you look up the meaning of a person's name, their surname or their personal name, you'll find that, almost always there's a meaning attached to it, unless it's literally a made-up name. And it should be that way with your characters. If you have a character name, it should fit into the language that they speak, right? It should sound like it comes from them. And that can be a little tricky, because here on Earth we have a lot of borrowing of languages. But one thing you need to keep in mind when we borrow is that when we take a new word into our language, we make that word conform to the phonetics of our language, right? English is renowned for having some wacky spelling rules, right? And a lot of times the spelling just doesn't fit with phonetics. But that's because a lot of times the spelling is more about the history of the word than it is about the pronunciation of the word. That can make things seem difficult, but think about your English, right? And think about when someone mispronounces a word. In your brain, which knows the language way more than you do, right, consciously, your brain tells you that doesn't sound right. Why doesn't it sound right? Because English has a certain set of sounds that are associated with it, like all languages do. And English has a bunch of unspoken rules on how those sounds can be combined together and how they can't be combined together. So if you're putting sounds together in a way that doesn't sound natural to the English ear, the tendency is to take those loan words and just force them into an English pronunciation. That happens all the time with all loan words, right? It's the way loan words work. So using that, you could see that, like, we have a name like Jonathan, my son's name, right? Family name, Jonathan. Now, Jonathan, is that an English name? Does it come from Middle English, going back through Old English? No, right? Like a lot of our names, it comes from the Middle East, right? Now, do you think they pronounce it Jonathan? Doesn't sound right, right? But it conforms to the English pronunciation. The same with Dave, right? Dave doesn't sound that Hebrew when I just say Dave, my name, Dave, right? But if we take David out of Hebrew and put it into English, that's how we say it, David, right? Sometimes this changes the name a lot. Think about William and Guillaume. Guy is the shortening of Guillaume, and Bill is the shortening of William. Guy and Bill are the same name, but they've taken different linguistic paths, right? This happens with place names too, and that's another thing to think about, not just with your characters, but with your place names. If you are writing about elves and they have a very flowery, soft, musical language, and then they come from the Artak Mountains, it doesn't really fit, right? Just like with personal names, we make place names conform. So like Montana and Colorado, right? Those are not pronounced with their Spanish pronunciation. I grew up in Colorado, and there are a lot of examples of this where someone's taken a Spanish place name and the English-speaking community has murdered the pronunciation of that place name. My favorite and most hated one is not in Colorado, though. It's in Georgia. In Georgia, I used to live in a small place called Grovetown, just outside of Augusta. And there's another small town around there called Martinez. It's Martinez, but they pronounce it Martinez. And that is very, very frustrating as a Spanish speaker. So that is, as much as it may frustrate me, growing up around Spanish names and place names, and you know, pronunciation is key when I'm wanting to communicate with somebody and have them understand me. And then I go to Georgia, and when I say Martinez, I am corrected and told that it's Martinez. That is a frustrating and annoying thing. However, it's the way we deal with place names, right? So keep that in mind when you're using the languages of your characters. And I'm going to go ahead and end part 2 now. I've got a few more things I want to talk about. We're going to do that in part 3, but part 3 is going to be next week. Like I told you in my last update, I wanted to do kind of a special sort of thing for Halloween. So that's what's coming up next time. I want you guys to have a great rest of your day, great couple of days. I want to thank you for watching my videos, whether you're watching them on Facebook or YouTube. I do appreciate it. I also, the few of you who do, I do appreciate the likes and shares that you give. Visibility is key in anything like this. The more people that see it, the more I'll be able to produce better content in the future, right? And that's the ultimate goal. I want to be making things that look better instead of filming on my cell phone from a bad angle. It'd be nice to have, if not a camera, then a mobile device with a better camera I don't know if you know about the Galaxy on 5, but at least the one I have, things can look a little fuzzy. The audio pickup is also not great. So the more people that know about the videos and enjoy them, the better content I'm able to produce, and that's my ultimate goal. I want to be making good stuff for you guys because the few of you who watch them do really appreciate it. So if you want to support me, go ahead and get that like and share. If you want to know about my future updates, make sure you hit that bell notification icon. That'll give you a notice from YouTube anytime I post something new. And if you want to support me in a little bit more personal or financial way, I've got the Patreon page, patreon.com/touchbone. So you can go ahead there. There are a number of exclusives for the Patreon subscribers. Things that you can't get anywhere else, and probably never will get anything else, including access to anything that I publish, and free copies of anything that I publish, access to all of the working documents I use when I'm writing, and the few videos that haven't been posted here but have been saved for later. So it can be a good time. Anyway, thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. You guys have been great. Goodbye.